Hey everybody, it's Chris Kresser. Welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. This week we have a question from Beth. Let's give it a listen.
Hi Chris, my name's Beth. Wondering if you can comment about your reaction to the What the Health documentary that's on Netflix and quite popular right now. I have the BRCA2 mutation and have known for about 3 years and am feeling pretty defeated when looking towards the way to eat to prevent breast cancer. I feel like this journey started out, I was vegan, then a bunch of research and experts pointed me towards paleo. What the Health documentary, every time, you get new information, you feel pulled in that direction. So would love your thoughts. Thank you.
Well, we received several questions about the What the Health documentary, not just from Beth, and thank you all for sending those in. They were all quite similar, so I'm just going to consolidate the answer here to Beth's question because I think it will cover everybody's question. At least once or twice a year over the past several years, there's been some big media story suggesting that red meat or eggs will kill you, or a plant-based diet is the best choice, or that vegetarians live longer than omnivores, or other such unfounded claims. And every year, a slew of researchers, scientists, and other critics, including me, debunk these stories. I will admit that it gets a little bit tiresome saying the same thing over and over again, but I've come to accept that this is just part of my job. It's part of my role. Fortunately, in the case of What the Health, it's such a shockingly inaccurate and biased documentary that by the time I got around to writing about it or addressing it, it had been widely criticized by experts across the entire spectrum. And because of that, I didn't write a critique as I typically would. There's even an article by a vegan dietitian, believe it or not, that slams the claims made by What the Health. And that alone should tell you something. But clearly, there is a need for more attention here because I still get questions. In fact, I had a few family members over the past few weeks send me an email and say that they had watched this documentary and they were concerned about their current diet and wondering if I had seen it and if I thought that they should consider a vegan diet. Now, a podcast isn't the best venue for a point-by-point rebuttal of the ridiculous claims made in What the Health, so I'm going to link to all of the best written pieces in the show notes on my website. And at the end of the episode, I'll give you the link for that so that you can click those links and read the articles and follow those arguments in a more explicit way if you want to do that. I'm also going to link to all of my previous articles, or at least the most salient ones, debunking claims that red meat and eggs cause heart disease and cancer, and reviewing research showing that vegans and vegetarians are typically at much higher risk of nutrient deficiency. So in this podcast, I'm going to give you a broader overview of what's wrong with this movie and why it shouldn't have any impact on your diet choices. And when we're evaluating claims about the best human diet, we have to look at it from two angles. One is an evolutionary perspective, and the second is modern epidemiological and clinical evidence. As we'll see, What the Health fails miserably on both counts. The evolutionary perspective is important because it informs us about what a natural human diet really is. The evolutionary biologist Theodoskius Dobzhansky once said, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." And what he meant was that all organisms are adapted to survive and thrive in a particular environment. And when that environment changes faster than the organism can adapt, a mismatch occurs. For 66,000 generations, humans ate primarily meat and fish, wild fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, and some starchy tubers and plants. There were some differences, of course, in the ancestral diets geographically. The Inuit typically ate a very high-fat diet and low carbohydrate intake because of the limited availability of plant foods in that part of the world, whereas people like the Kitavans and Tucasenta in the South Pacific, where fruit and starchy tubers like sweet potatoes are readily available, tended to eat a high percentage of calories as carbohydrate. But despite those differences, the ancestral human diets shared a lot in common. They weren't eating cheese doodles and processed and refined foods, but they also weren't vegetarians or vegans. And in fact, no human population in the history of civilization has ever been recorded surviving on a vegan diet. Again, that alone should tell you something. And there are few, if any, known human populations that even followed a vegetarian diet exclusively, and if they did, it was usually not by choice. They would often go to great lengths to trade with other local peoples for prized animal foods, for example. So why does this matter? Well, as I just said, all organisms are shaped by their environment, and that's true from the bottom to the top of the food chain. If we consider bacteria that live very deep in the ocean near hydrothermal vents where there's no light at all, they're able to survive remarkably. Most other organisms on this planet require light or photosynthesis, whether they require it directly or whether they consume foods that require it. But these bacteria that live near hydrothermal vents use sulfur compounds, particularly hydrogen sulfide, a chemical which is highly toxic to most known organisms, to produce organic material through the process of chemosynthesis. So this is a great example of an organism that has been highly shaped by its environment. If you take those hydrothermal bacteria and you drop them into a shallow ocean that's exposed to light, they'll die. Cats are another example. Cats we now know, or we've known for some time, but it's now more recognized by veterinarians that cats are true carnivores. They don't eat anything other than meat in their natural environment. And that's why you see now, if you go into a pet food store, you'll see that all of the premium cat foods say meat only, and often raw meat, because that is the way that cats would eat in their normal natural environment. I even remember a story a while back about a vegan couple in France, I think, who had killed their cats essentially by feeding them a vegan diet. So, this is just one small example of where ideology can go wrong when it doesn't match with the evolutionary perspective. Zookeepers are aware of this as well. There's been a growing movement in zoos to feed animals the diet that they would typically eat in their natural environment. And this came out of the recognition that animals were getting sick in zoos. They at first weren't sure why, but then somebody actually, brought this to light and suggested that, hey, maybe these animals are getting sick because we're feeding them things that they're not adapted to eat and that they wouldn't be typically eating in the wild. And now there's been a much bigger movement to address that to the great benefit of the animals that are living in these zoos. Now, humans are omnivores. We're not true carnivores like cats. And this means we can eat both plant and animal foods. Our diet is not as limited as the diet of a hydrothermal bacterium or a cat. But like all other organisms and animals, we require a certain mix of things to survive. In our case, a certain mix of macronutrients, protein, fat, and carbohydrates, and micronutrients to thrive. It does not make sense from an evolutionary perspective that the best human diet is one that is lacking in nutrients that are essential to our health. Yet that's exactly the case with the vegan diet. The biggest issue is that it's lacking in B12 and vitamin D. Now, a common myth amongst vegetarians and vegans is that it's possible to get B12 from plant sources like seaweed, fermented soy, spirulina, and brewer's yeast. But plant foods that are said to contain B12 actually contain B12 analogs that are called cobamides that block the intake and utilization of B12 and can actually increase the need for true B12. So this explains why recent studies that use much more sensitive methods of detecting deficiency have shown that 83% of vegans are B12 deficient compared to just 5% of omnivores. Now, there's also no vitamin D in a typical vegan diet. There are some obscure species of mushrooms that can provide large amounts of vitamin D, but these mushrooms are rarely consumed and they're pretty difficult to obtain. This explains why vitamin D levels are 58% lower in vegetarians and 74% lower in vegans than in omnivores. But a vegan diet is low in other key nutrients as well, including calcium, iron, zinc, EPA, DHA, and vitamin A. Now, there's some crucial concepts that you need to understand when evaluating diet claims, and one is bioavailability. So, for example, although vegetarians often have similar iron intakes to omnivores on paper, it is more common for them, and especially vegans, to be iron deficient. Why? Because iron in animal products, which is called heme iron, is far better absorbed and assimilated, aka bioavailable, than ferrous or non-heme iron found in plant foods. The same is true with calcium. On paper, calcium intake is similar in vegetarians and omnivores, probably because both eat dairy products, but it's much lower in vegans who are often deficient. But calcium bioavailability from plant foods is affected by their levels of oxalate and phytate, which are inhibitors of calcium absorption and thus decrease the amount of calcium the body can extract from plant foods. So while leafy greens like spinach and kale have a relatively high calcium content, the calcium is not efficiently absorbed during digestion. One study suggests that it would take 16 servings of spinach to get the same amount of absorbable calcium from an 8-ounce glass of milk. That would be 33 cups of baby spinach, or around 5 to 6 cups of cooked spinach. Another important concept to understand is the difference between precursor and active forms of nutrients. EPA and DHA are the long-chain omega-3 fats, and they've been universally recognized as crucial to health, and they're a really good example of the important difference between precursor and active forms. Plant foods do contain linoleic acid and alpha-linolenic acid. Those are the precursor fats which can be converted in the body into EPA and DHA, which are the ones we really need. While it's possible for some alpha-linolenic acid from plant foods to be converted into EPA and DHA, that conversion is poor in humans. It's about 5 to 10% of ALA going into EPA and about 2 to 5% of ALA getting converted to DHA. So this probably explains why vegetarians have 30% lower levels of EPA and DHA than omnivores, while vegans have 50% lower EPA levels and nearly 60% lower DHA levels. Another example is vitamin A. Retinol is the active form of vitamin A, and beta-carotene is the precursor. The idea that plant foods contain vitamin A is a common misconception. Plants actually contain beta-carotene, the precursor form. While beta-carotene is converted into vitamin A in humans, that conversion is very inefficient. For example, a single serving of liver per week would meet the RDA of 3,000 IU of retinol. To get the same amount from plant foods, you'd have to eat 2 cups of carrots, 1 cup of sweet potatoes, or 2 cups of kale every day. Moreover, traditional cultures consumed up to 10 times the RDA for vitamin A. It would be nearly impossible to get this amount of vitamin A from plant foods without juicing or taking supplements. The third concept you need to understand to evaluate diet claims is nutrient synergy. Most nutrients require the presence of other nutrients called cofactors to be absorbed and utilized. And we just talked about how very little of the plant-based ALA gets converted into DHA. This can lead to a double whammy effect where vegans are not eating preformed DHA, but they're also eating less of the nutrients required to convert the precursor plant fat ALA into the active EPA and DHA. Now finally, the fourth concept to understand is anti-nutrients or nutrient inhibitors. There are many substances that impair the absorption of nutrients. We talked about oxalate and phytate impairing the absorption of calcium, but that's not the only nutrient that they impair the absorption of. The absorption of non-heme or plant-based iron is inhibited by several commonly consumed substances such as coffee, tea, dairy products because of their calcium, supplemental fiber, and oxalate and phytate. But none of these substances, with the exception of calcium, has a significant effect on the absorption of heme iron from animal products. Again, this explains why vegetarian diets have been shown to reduce plant-based iron absorption by 70%, but total iron absorption by 85%. Zinc is another example. Many plant foods that contain zinc also contain phytic acid, which inhibits zinc absorption. And vegetarian diets tend to reduce zinc absorption by about 35% compared with omnivorous diets. And this explains why even when the diet on paper meets or exceeds the RDA for zinc, deficiency may still occur. In fact, one study suggested that vegetarians may require up to 50% more zinc than omnivores for exactly this reason. So at an absolute minimum, if you're following a vegan diet, you'd have to supplement with B12 and vitamin D to maintain health. But more likely, given the statistics that we just discussed, you'd also need to supplement with retinol or the active form of vitamin A, EPA and DHA, zinc, iron, and calcium. I hope it's clear that it makes no sense to claim that a vegan diet is optimal for humans if you have to supplement with several nutrients to make it work. This is ridiculous, I think, from an evolutionary perspective. We wouldn't even be here to have this conversation, and human evolution would never have occurred as it did on a vegan diet. So let's move on to the epidemiological and clinical evidence that was used in What the Health. The journalist Nina Teichholz did a point-by-point analysis of the so-called science in What the Health. So I'm not going to go into that level of detail here, but we will link to her article in the show notes so that you can go check it out. But here's some key points that I want to highlight. Number one is that most of the claims made in the film were based on epidemiological studies. And these are limited in that they can only show correlation, not causation. If you've been following my work for any length of time, you've heard me say this over and over again. One of the first things you learn in research methodology, which clearly the creators of the film have not studied, is that correlation is not causation. And there are a lot of fun examples of this you can find online, such as the number of people who drowned by falling into a swimming pool correlates with the number of films that Nicolas Cage appeared in. Or the per capita consumption of cheese correlates with the number of people who died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. Now, I think it's probably pretty clear that this doesn't mean that people drowning in pools cause Nicolas Cage to appear in more films, or that eating more cheese causes someone to die by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. That's absurd. Yet this is often the kind of leap that is made in popular media articles, or in this case, What the Health, that are trying to extract causation from studies that were never designed to prove a causal relationship. Epidemiological studies are designed to generate hypotheses which then need to be verified with clinical trials or other experiments. Epidemiological studies also have other limitations. So, for example, the extreme unreliability of food frequency questionnaires, which depend upon people accurately remembering what they ate over the last 6 to 12 months. I can't even remember what I ate 6 days ago, and I pay more attention to my food than most people I know. Another issue with epidemiological studies is that they can't fully adjust for confounding variables. So, for example, let's say they're looking at people who eat more red meat. They will usually try to control for the most obvious variables like smoking and physical activity, but they're not looking at things like the status of their microbiome, or how much they're sleeping, or other healthy or unhealthy behaviors that they might be engaging in. It's virtually impossible to design a study that will control for all of the confounding variables that we know about, much less the ones that we don't know about. And we now know, for example, how important the microbiome is to health, but I'm not aware of any studies that are controlling for differences in the gut microbiome in the research design. So that's a huge problem. So for all of these reasons, scientists in most fields, with the exception of nutrition, which tends to be out in its own world when it comes to this stuff, agree that small associations with risk ratios of less than 2 are not really reliable in epidemiological research. Number 2, clinical trials are generally more reliable than epidemiology, but the quality of them still varies considerably depending on several factors. So, was the trial randomized? Did it have a control group? Was it sizable? Was it on a relevant population? Did enough people finish the trial to make it meaningful? And do its results and do the data actually support the claim made in the conclusion? You might be surprised how often the researchers' own data don't match their conclusion. Number 3, newspaper magazine articles and blog posts are not rigorous sources of evidence. They can be informative and they can be helpful in summarizing the existing evidence, especially when they link to it, but they aren't considered valid ways of scientifically backing an argument. So with all of this in mind, Teichholz ranked the evidence presented in What the Health. And as she says in her conclusion, quote, in sum, 96% of the data do not support the claims made in this film. The film does not cite a single rigorous randomized controlled trial on humans supporting its arguments. Instead, What the Health presents a great deal of weak epidemiological data, case studies on one or two people, or other inconclusive evidence. Some of the studies cited actually conclude the opposite of what is claimed. There are many other critiques of the science in What the Health out there on the web right now, including one from Science Based Medicine, a critical review by a vegan dietitian, which I mentioned earlier, and a point-by-point takedown on Vox. And we'll link to all of these in the show notes. But one last thing that we need to talk about before we finish up, and that is agenda. The two producers behind the film are Kip Anderson and Keegan Kuhn, who are vegans and animal rights activists. As Nina Teichholz writes in her conclusion, quote, the majority of papers turn out to be posts by vegan diet doctors, mainly Michael Greger and Neil Barnard. Both of these men are passionate animal welfare activists, so one can never know if they are seeking truth about a healthy diet or have started from the premise that they'd like to end all domestication of animals and proceed to cherry-pick the science back from there. Given the weak to non-existent data presented in the film, the latter seems to be a pretty good possibility. In fact, What the Health, based on zero sound science, is quite likely a piece of animal welfare advocacy masquerading as a public health film. End quote. And that's exactly the problem. We know from drug research that industry-sponsored trials, so studies paid for by pharmaceutical companies, are much more likely to report favorable results than independent trials because of biased reporting, biased interpretation, or both. This is a well-established phenomenon, and it's been explored in both the media and the scientific literature. And it really shouldn't be that surprising. So the fact that this film is made by two vegan animal rights activists doesn't necessarily invalidate its conclusions. But the fact that they only included experts and doctors that share their views, cherry-picked weak studies and unreliable sources like blog posts to support their argument, and ignored the huge body of credible scientific evidence that contradicts their claims, makes this film a dangerous piece of propaganda rather than a factual report on human health and diet. Okay, that's it for today. I hope you found this to be helpful and informative. Head over to chriskresser.com/what-the-health to find a comprehensive list of critiques of this documentary and articles with real science and research that debunk its fundamental claims. Okay, keep sending me your questions at chriskresser.com/podcast question. Hope you're enjoying the show, and I'll talk to you next time. That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at chriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/chriskresser or facebook.com/chriskresserlac. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.